Now we're going to get into the topic, the important topic of addressing the challenge of workers and communities left behind. We have just an outstanding panel. Let me welcome to the stage, well, after you get, Todd, come on up. Todd Young is really cool. Todd Young, Senator of Indiana from the United States Senate, flew in today for this session. Thank you very much. We're just going to, oh, then we have Amy Klobuchar, too. Wow. Democrat from Minnesota. Thank you so much, Senator Klobuchar. Jared Bernstein, who I just introduced as the intellectual soulmate of Lawrence Kudlow. Senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, of course, Vice President Biden's former senior economic advisor. And we have Scott Winship, who has got a great Twitter feed, by the way. Scott is project director of the Office of the Vice Chairman of the Joint Economic Committee. And back we have Lettieri Laissez-Faire, co-founder, John Lettieri, co-founder and senior director for policy and strategy at the Economic Innovation Group. John?
Thank you. So I'm really excited about this panel. This is a great group, and we're talking about something that we've kind of been building towards all day, which is this idea of what's different about this recovery and why is it leaving workers and communities behind. And that's something that's near and dear to the hearts and the work of everybody we have on stage today. Senator Klobuchar, I wanted to just dive in and start with you. I know you're very focused on the rural component of this. Many rural areas have been particularly hard hit during this recovery and have seen a lack of growth, a lack of dynamism, a lack of new businesses and jobs. How are you thinking about this in terms of your own constituency in Minnesota? And in terms of the role of the federal government, Larry talked a little bit about the role of the private sector and states. What do you think the role of the federal government is in trying to intervene in those types of situations?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, thank you for having me. I was amused as Larry was talking about happiness. My state was ranked 2 years ago the second happiest state in the country. Thank you, with Hawaii being number one. I wonder why. But I think part of it was his point that we have had a pretty consistently low unemployment rate. And of course, like every other state, we got hit by the downturn and came out of it pretty well. And we're at 3-4% for unemployment. We are second per capita for Fortune 500 companies, and yet our fifth for agriculture. So we have a nice mix of that. But one of the things that I have noticed over the years is this continual gap with our rural areas. And it's a political divide, of course, but it is also an economic divide. And when you think about it, how we would tolerate it here right now in Washington, D.C., if you wanted to say, look at the newspaper online, or if you're a doctor and you want to look at your reports or an x-ray, there's a doctor near Brainerd, Minnesota, who for years would go to the McDonald's parking lot to look at an x-ray, or a kid in a tribal area who would get Wi-Fi and then look out the window and see all these kids in his front yard doing their homework, because that's how they got their Wi-Fi. So that is a digital divide, and it's an economic problem for our country, because when you have actually a poverty rate that is worse for kids in rural areas than urban, we have a problem that we have to confront, because I believe if you want to keep our economy going with all the new technology coming at us, what we know is going to be a reduction of existing jobs, then we have to have continually new ideas and new startups. So we're a country that makes things, invent things, exports to the world. And rural areas with their lower cost of living, if you just keep Duluth, Minnesota off the map, the home of Cirrus Jets, one of our few jet makers in America, or the home of Epicurean cutting boards and a lot of new ideas, if you make it hard for people to live there, and they all have to go into the Twin Cities or go to Chicago or New York City, you're not going to have that kind of hubs of activity and new ideas. And you're going to make it harder for us to create these new companies. So I think for the economy as a whole, we have a good argument, but we also have, obviously, we have people that we want to be able to have live and grow up where their parents did. And so I've been really focused on this issue, and it means broadband, it means the transportation funding, and it also means making sure their education system can get the latest education so that they can hook up by the internet, so they can make sure we have fair funding of education, and then I think we're going to just have a more fair and equitable feeling among our citizenry, which has been lacking, if you haven't noticed. And that means leaving no one behind and having an economic agenda for our country that is in keeping with the global competitive economy that we find ourselves in.
Senator Young, I want you to jump in. I know that this is an issue that's really important to you and something you're taking a look at in your own state, in Indiana. I'll just note that Senator Klobuchar talked about the need for new startups, new businesses, the need for a future-oriented economic pathway for people in these communities. And yet a lot of what we hear, I think kind of the general media narrative is we need to restore manufacturing jobs to a kind of arbitrary baseline or things like that. Both of your states have really high percentages of workforce in manufacturing. Are you more focused on jobs of the future and trying to help transition into new industries, or do you think there's a value in trying to hold on to a certain baseline of we've had these manufacturing jobs, we have this industry, and judging economic policy against that performance?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can do both. We're the most manufacturing intensive state in the country on a per capita basis, so that certainly is a point of emphasis in my service. But we also need to be more dynamic, to use something that EIG, your focal point. We need to make sure that people are pioneering new technologies, identifying new opportunities to serve the market, and therefore growing new jobs and taking small enterprises to a larger level. And we're not seeing that rate of churn in the economy. So I tend to think that growth solves a lot of problems. So there are macroeconomic things that we can do from a policy standpoint, whether it's reforming our tax code or our regulatory atmosphere or bringing down healthcare costs. Or this is sort of the team efforts that we're involved in and will continue to be involved in. But a rising tide does not perhaps lift all boats, and I think we're increasingly recognizing that. Some boats need patching, and some of that will take the form of education, say career academies, career and technical education. Almost every state in the country is recognizing the value in ensuring that, that people who graduate from high school have access to some sort of training, and that training leads to a certification thereafter. That's a way to increase wages and opportunity for nearly everyone. It's that demographic in particular that's really been hit hard in the state of Indiana, where 2 out of every 3 Hoosiers live in a county that experienced a lower rate of growth coming out of this last recession than people in the rest of the country. The other thing we can do is try and make sure that people have those supports. Most of them, I must emphasize, available in civil society, which will augment their skill sets, which will help them achieve their personal dreams, which typically does involve going out there, getting a job, moving up the economic ladder, the proverbial American dream. Very frustrating to me is the evidence that the rate of economic mobility across different economic quintiles is fairly stagnant in this country. It's arguably, I actually think the consensus view from progressive and conservative economists is it's slightly lower than it is in other countries. Jared could speak to that with greater specificity and credibility than I could. But I think we can do both, and I favor the creation of public-private partnerships, harnessing the great American tradition of going out there, establishing a not-for-profit or a community group or a private enterprise to solve social ills. We have the most vibrant civil society in all of human history, and there's a growing evidence base, a very rigorous one, demonstrating how to mitigate the rate of preterm births, how to improve the re-entry of incarcerated individuals back into the workforce, making them into productive citizens. Government's not very good at this kind of stuff. And to the extent we can bring in private capital to scale up these things, those boats, to go back to the analogy, have an opportunity to rise and everyone can participate in the economy. And of course, we all benefit from that through a higher rate of economic growth. So those are some initial thoughts about approaches we might take.
You mentioned social capital. That's a good segue into, Scott, what you're working on at the Joint Economic Committee. A kind of unusual and ambitious project on quantifying and analyzing something that maybe economists and certainly the JEC doesn't talk about or hasn't historically talked about as much. Why do a social capital project now? How does this influence our thinking about upward mobility and this issue of people being left behind and what they need?
Yeah, thanks, John. And I should start out by saying if you take one fact away from this conference, I hope it is that You will remember that my comments do not reflect the Joint Economic Committee or Senator Mike Lee.
On which I serve.
Senator
No, it's fine.
Klobuchar will keep me honest there. No, but I certainly would want to reiterate the importance of civil society that Senator Young was talking about. You know, the Economic Innovation Group has sort of crossed business dynamism with things like how distressed communities are and how much economic mobility they have. And certainly economics is incredibly important for all these issues. But what we're looking at is another dimension that tends to get overlooked, and that is the extent to which deficits of social life tend to also affect opportunities down the road. And so, for instance, we have a measure at the county level of the availability of social support. And it turns out that's basically as strongly related to Raj Chetty's economic mobility results at the county level as some of the more economic indicators. You know, there are indices out there such as Distressed Communities Index. There's the Opportunity Index that Opportunity Nation puts out. And they all tend to show three places that are doing badly. It's the Southeast, it's Appalachia, and it's the Southwest. And those areas are very different and probably will require different sorts of solutions. The Southeast has a lot of single parenthood. Single parents around the country, many of them are doing great work. I'm a single dad myself. But if you think that having healthy families is important for kids' outcomes, you certainly worry about that. In Appalachia, the opioid epidemic is just killing people, literally killing people. That's something you actually don't see in the Southeast. So each of these regions is sort of different, and our project is trying to explore the different aspects of our social life that have broken down over time and differences across the country in terms of who has more social capital and who has less.
Jared, you spend a lot of time thinking about and writing about poverty. You're one of our best scholars on that issue. And I know lately you've been thinking and writing about this idea of direct jobs and how government can intervene in a very direct and active way. I'll go ahead and set this up by saying a lot of folks, particularly conservatives, would say we worry about crowd out effects of government stepping into a marketplace like that, and what does that discourage in the private marketplace. There's also the question of whether this displaces or obviates the need for other types of social safety measures. And another idea that's become popular is the idea of universal basic income, which is kind of akin to a direct subsidy in the job space in certain ways. How do you think about those proposals in terms of solving the problem that we're actually facing now? How much of that is thinking ahead to if trends continue, we may need to pull certain levers? Where are you on those things?
Well, let me start by saying thanks for inviting me, and that I've quite enjoyed the conversation so far. And I think that the three speakers I've heard on the panel so far are all talking about really important things, and there's some bipartisanship, which I think is hear enough of. And I think we'd certainly disagree as to how to get to some of these places, but the fact that we're identifying similar goals in terms of helping people who are stuck in left behind places, to me is a very positive thing. I would be hesitant to depend on, I'm not quite sure what folks mean when they say civil society. I mean, because I think it probably means different things to different people, and it's not the kind of thing I'd want to depend on. I tend to think of government intervention as being there for when the civil part isn't there, when it falls out. And one of the interventions that I've been thinking about is direct job creation, as you've suggested, because there are places across the country, and while I take Scott's framing of the three aggregated areas, another thing we know is that there are actually places in Michigan, places in Pennsylvania, places in Indiana, where labor demand just isn't reaching, even with a 4.3% unemployment rate. And I've had long experience of trying to think of indirect ways to help those places, say through investment sorts of tax credits, and I think the track record for that is lousy. What economists will often tell you is if you're stuck in a place like that, move to a different place, a place where there's more opportunity. Well, politicians can't say that, understandably. They can't say, what you need to do is move out of my district. And nor should they, because as you suggested, people don't want to. So we have to think about how to bring opportunity to places like that. And I can think of no more direct way to create jobs than direct job creation.
But address the issue then of
displacement?
Displacement.
So displacement, just so everybody knows, is this idea that if you subsidize an employee an employer might say, well, the current employee that I have who is unsubsidized is costing me more than, Jill is unsubsidized, but Mary is subsidized. I'm going to fire Jill and hire Mary. And that doesn't create a new job. That just subsidizes a job that would have happened anyway. That's displacement. And I think you do have to worry about displacement at, in places that are at full employment. Our experience during the Recovery Act, when we had an unemployment rate that got all the way to 10%, was that we had a program like this, the TANF Emergency Fund Program, that subsidized employment, time limited, 3 to 6 months typically, to the tune of 80 or 90%, and displacement didn't look like it was a problem there. We looked as closely as we could at those issues. So it matters a lot. If you're talking about some of the places where there's a lot of slack in the labor market, I think displacement is a concern, but a second order one, and there has to be rules against it, and people who break those rules have to face some sort of a fine for doing so. But I think it's a manageable problem.
That's interesting. Senator Klobuchar, back to you. Curious, you're in a maybe unenviable position from your standpoint of Republicans control the White House, the Senate, the House. They're setting the agenda. But on these issues, there's growing empirical consensus that A, there's a problem that needs to be addressed, and B, there is some policy consensus as well around at least some of the low-hanging fruit. What are you most optimistic about in this legislative environment we can get done in this broader area of opportunity and addressing people in the left-behind communities?
Right. I mean, obviously, this is a very polarized time, and a lot of the things we're hearing from the White House make it more difficult, I think, for people to make deals. But that aside, sitting next to the couch with someone where they always confuse Minneapolis and Indianapolis.
That's
so
right.
We have
They
to
always
work
do.
together.
That's right, yeah.
We're both meccas of medical device industry, and so see that need for high-tech workers. I'd say these things. One, there is consensus on worker training, using apprenticeship model more, doing more with our high schools, so kids, instead of not graduating at all, could get interested in a job. And we just haven't done enough radical change with the high schools in my mind, because I have one high school that's new in a rural area, actually, because there's a lot of manufacturing around there. They have a manufacturing track. You walk in there, and there's these beautiful robotics machineries that they're learning things on. And I think that's the issue. You're not always going to have that in high schools, so you try to have them learn on the job. You try to have them learn where they, at community colleges. And we just have to look at our industry needs. We have millions of job openings across this country, including in my state, and yet we have kids getting 4-year degrees and then not being able to get jobs. So we have to say not everyone wants to get a 4-year degree. My sister never graduated from high school. She went on to get a GED years later after working in a plant. She then went on to go to a community college and get a 2-year degree in Iowa, and then from there she got 2 more years and became an accountant. My dad got a 2-year degree, so I know this in my own life. And then the second piece of this is immigration reform. That might seem counterintuitive when we have people out of work, but history has shown when we bring in talent, we create jobs. 70 of our Fortune 500 companies headed by immigrants, 25% of our US Nobel laureates won by people who were born in other countries. And right now we're at a shambles in our immigration policy. So I think the comprehensive immigration bill that we worked on and passed in the Senate would be actually helpful to our economy, and as Grover Norquist has said in his support for the bill, would significantly bring down our debt. The third piece of this is incentives to keep jobs in America, and I think those things are doable if we had a more functioning situation with the White House, but that means tax reform. And the last thing would be infrastructure, and that's the first thing the president said when he got elected, that he wanted to work on infrastructure. I know they're rolling some things out this week. We are ready to work with them, but if it's some of the financing that he's talked about, I'm not certain that's going to get us to where we need to go. But there are things of consensus, and I put workforce training right up there. Immigration reform, if people were willing to take a little bit of a leap and see it as the economic imperative that it is. Tax reform, which will be the hardest, I would say. And then the last would be infrastructure, which should be something that we can do this year.
Senator Young, I'd love to get your take on that same question.
I've sort of forgotten what the question is, but I know what the general
The
topic. So,
things that are
where are there
doable.
areas
Yeah,
of,
yeah.
of
Are you
alignment?
implying that
Well,
I filibustered?
no.
Okay. No, it was doable things. Doable
So one of the doable things is a recognition of the baseline facts. AEI collaborated with Brookings before the last presidential election, the hope that the election would actually be about ideas. They had a report on trying to serve our nation's most vulnerable and some of the policy solutions the next president working with the next Congress might embrace. They together, progressives and conservatives, agreed that if you define our nation's social support system, roughly the 80 or so programs that are targeted towards helping lower income individuals, if you define success as trying to move the recipients above the poverty level, if you measure poverty based on your ability to consume things wherever you might live, then those programs are working. So let me disabuse anyone on the panel or here who might be under the misimpression that I think that civil society is the only solution. My only point here is that I think we need to move beyond moving people above the poverty line and allow them to continue to believe in what we have historically called the American dream. This belief that receiving this constellation of government programs is the end as opposed to the means. I put forward legislation, actually passed unanimously out of the House of Representatives last Congress, that would facilitate the development of public-private partnerships. It would scale up evidence-based interventions. Say the nurse-family partnership. We know the nurse-family partnership reduces the level of preterm births and improves educational outcomes. It's the dispatching of healthcare workers along with social workers in dense urban areas, staying with the expectant mother for the first, over the course of the pregnancy to ensure that proper healthcare is exhibited, and then that there's enough interaction with that child for the first 2 years of that child's life. What happens when you actually improve outcomes for that child? Well, you save money. You save Medicaid expenditures. You save special education dollars and so forth. And my idea is to take those future savings, as long as outcomes are achieved, and pay back the investors who put in money to scale up the nurse-family partnership across different geographies. It's a pilot program. We think we could pilot this in various geographies across the country. They've already done this in the United Kingdom. They've done it with mixed degrees of success to reduce recidivism in New York City. I announced I was running for the United States Senate, and immediately this thing came off of the agenda. So I do think there's opportunities for bipartisan work on some of these areas. I think this is low-hanging fruit. Career and technical education, we're getting a lot better at this. The unique partnerships that exist between our high schools and our career and technical centers, oftentimes co-located together. We see higher wages. We see in places like Indiana, did I just turn off? We see in places like Indiana, people prepared to fill the manufacturing jobs of tomorrow after undergoing these programs, and we see a higher graduation rate from high school as a result of career and technical education. I think the federal government can also serve as a repository of best practices for both states and for local communities. I often ask welfare administrators or social service administrators from our various states how they come up with their best practices. Where do you learn of your best practices? And these are busy people, oftentimes very conscientious public servants, trying to do the right thing. And they read a little bit, they communicate with one another, but it seems like they gather the most valuable information at the annual or biannual conferences they have. Now, these conferences have value, but this does not strike me as a particularly rigorous way of sharing best practices. So I just had some legislation signed into law that establishes a clearinghouse at Health and Human Services. They're working with the Department of Labor to make sure that at the state and local level, we know what really is working. And then we can, from a policy standpoint, reward those interventions that truly deliver on opportunity and upward mobility for our most at-risk populations. So those are some thoughts directionally about where I think we need to go, and I think I want to associate myself with just about everything that Amy said. I mean, I think we have an opportunity to really work together in this space.
On that note, the senator needs to leave.
I have somehow double booked with Senator McCain, but since I'm going to leave when I'm ahead, as you've associated.
Yeah, it's great.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. So, Jared, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in quickly.
Do you want to move to the other couch, too? I mean, we're all a little, we want to spread out.
Okay, that's fine.
I like the idea of you guys being closer to each other.
Probably never sat this close to Scott Winship, and I like it. I just want to respond to some of those interesting ideas we just heard from Senator Young. I don't know that much about this, the example you raised, but it sounds good, and I've always, at least in the abstract, liked this idea of public-private partnerships, but I do think, what matters are the details.
Yeah.
But the way you set it up and teed it up, I think, is exactly right, and I'd like to underscore that, and I'd like to also point out how very different that is than at least what I hear coming out of politics right now, which is, you have this baseline safety net, and we can argue about its effectiveness. I would argue that it's not only helped in the consumption sense that you suggested. The anti-poverty effectiveness of the safety net has increased significantly over time, and at the same time, it's become much more work-oriented, and I think that's a plus. But also, many of those programs, EITC, Medicaid, SNAP, food stamps, turn out to actually have some long-term benefits for kids who got them once those kids reached adulthood. There's been this kind of quasi-experimental design research that finds that if you look at a kid who grew up with SNAP versus one who didn't, they tend to do better on earnings, employment, health, educational outcomes. So I think it's a bit more of an investment story than just a consumption one. But the way you teed it up struck me as exactly right, which is let's keep that baseline and build on top of it. What concerns me is that the Trump budget, and I would argue Paul Ryan has also veered into this, doesn't accept that at all, and in fact slashes the heck out of Medicaid, cuts it by 45% if you combine the ACA and the budget, takes $193 billion out of food stamps, et cetera. Now, I'm not saying every single dollar in every single program is perfectly spent, but I think that the idea of recognizing the benefits of the current safety net and building on top of that in an opportunity sense makes a lot of sense.
Go ahead, Senator.
So in order to maintain a political coalition to build on top of the existing safety net, I think existing programs need to be iteratively improved. We're not very good at this in government, and that means rigorous evaluation. That means oftentimes piloting, certain changes to programs and then scaling up those that work. Mm-hmm. And so I see opportunities within our government agencies to engage in that sort of work. And I think we have to stay vigilant on the Hill as we oversee these various programs to ensure that they are rigorously evaluated. And incidentally, within civil society, it costs $100,000 now to do a randomized controlled trial across multiple sites, right? So that's not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things. So we will continue to see the evidence base grow. Some of the things in civil society can inform our programmatic efforts in government as well. So again, I wouldn't anticipate great bipartisan, or partisan opposition to what I've just laid out. I see really fertile ground here from a policy standpoint.
A lot of senses the question is willpower. Do we really want to prioritize the kind of things you're talking about? Because sometimes they just get lost in the mix of these broader debates. Yeah. Before our time ends, Scott, a lot of your work has been on upward mobility and this question of the American dream. And you hear a lot today about the American dream being under threat. Someone earlier mentioned upward mobility rates declining. Raj Chetty's work is really on everybody's mind now in terms of place and how that affects upward mobility. How would you assess the state of the American dream today in terms of what is the problem we're trying to solve or what is the baseline we're trying to get back to?
Yeah, no, so I think it's a complicated question.
That's why I gave you 3 minutes to answer.
And I'm going to take about 2 minutes and 50 seconds so that Jared can't respond to it. No, so I think it's important to distinguish between things are getting worse on the one hand, and the rate at which we're improving has stagnated or gotten worse. And I would argue that most of our economic problems are of the latter type. Relative mobility, this idea that if you start at the bottom, you can make it out of the bottom to the middle. Most of the research has actually shown that actually hasn't gotten any worse over time. You can find a paper or two that finds something different, but I would say a consensus for now among academics is that it hasn't worsened over time. Nobody thinks it's gotten better over time. Raj Chetty made a lot of headlines with a recent study that showed that absolute mobility has gotten worse over time. And this is the idea that you do better than your parents in absolute terms. Whether or not you go from the bottom to the middle, you're just better off than your folks are. And I think that's true. I've written that I think it's hard to find a way to say that's not true. But we do have to remember that is not the only thing. So in research that I'm doing now, it turns out that residents of developing countries believe they've experienced more upward mobility than residents of developed countries believe. So combine that with absolute mobility falling in the United States, and you have to ask yourself, would you rather be living in 1940 with a higher upward absolute mobility rate, but 1940 living standards? Would you rather be living in a developing country, but with higher absolute mobility, than living in the United States today? To me, that's a pretty obvious question to answer. Is, we'd much rather be here today where our living standards are much higher, even if our levels of absolute mobility have not risen. I also think it's the case that we understate how much things really have improved. And so it is true for the last 15 years or so, there hasn't been a lot of progress in terms of rising household incomes. They are about as high as they've ever been in world global history. But they've been stagnant for about 15 years. If you take a longer time period, say from the 1960s, it's actually not the case that there's been stagnation. Household incomes today at the middle are at least 45 to 50% higher than they were at the end of the 1970s. Hourly compensation of male workers at the median are something like a third higher today than they were in the late 1960s. A lot of that improvement was before 2000. A lot of it was in the second half of the 1990s. But nevertheless, I think it's hyperbole to say that the American dream is somehow over just because things are improving at a slower rate.
But that's great timing. It is interesting to note that's a very glass half full, very hopeful way to end. Although Jared, I'll let you rebut. But it's interesting to note that people's perception of the American dream has gone down pretty dramatically from where it had been just a couple decades ago, and maybe that perception challenge is really the one we're wrestling with. Jared, did you want to fist
Yeah,
fight?
I mean, I just quickly, because I think Scott gave a lot of accurate facts there. But I think it's a matter of your reference point. I mean, nobody compares themselves to 1960. Nobody even compares themselves to 5 years ago. People look at their living standards compared to where they are now and where they expect it to be. And on that level, there's been some real deterioration. And this decline in absolute mobility that Chetty found, I think you had a 90% chance of doing better than your parents down to a 50% chance. That's what really locks into people's heads. The idea that their kids are much less likely to do better than they did. And so I think we have to be careful. I think it's important to be accurate, as Scott was, about these long-term comparisons. But if you want to understand how people are thinking about today's economy and why they're frustrated by it, you can tell them, well, in fact, compensation went up from 1960 to the mid to 1980, paused for a while, went up a bit from 1995 to 2000, and has been flat since then. Feel better now? No, it just doesn't work that way.
Do we have time for questions, or we're all set? We're all set.
Hey, John, could I just close here and thank
I was gonna say.
EIG very much for the good work you've done with respect to distressed zip codes and some of the reports you put out. I'm going to be spending the month of August visiting distressed zip codes throughout the state of Indiana to try and get a better sense, on a very human level, what some of the challenges people are facing, and hopefully we can translate some of that work into policy.
I think that, I mean, if I just may, I mean, that's, and not to, cut into your time, I think that's really, really important. Joe Manchin was here earlier when we were talking that, they've got a very, I'd call it poor county, McDowell County, West Virginia. It's a great county, but it's stressed, has a lot of problems, and sometimes it's very important to go to those places and understand that, you have to make things work there, just not in the, Beverly Hills 90210 zip code.
So we'll invite you back next year for the 8th Summit, and you can report on what you learned.
Be great. I'll look forward to it.
Big
Thank
round
you
of
all.
applause. John Lettieri, thanks for running another great conversation. Scott Winship, Jared Bernstein, Senator Todd Young, thank you all very much for here.